Grainmaker. Welcome everyone to the Grainmaker Wrestling Podcast, a
Keep it in. Keep it in.
I try to. I'll see. Welcome everyone to the Grainmaker Wrestling Podcast, a Prairie Proud wrestling podcast covering everything from Winnipeg to worldwide. My name is Blair Pacheco, and today I have a very special guest that I'm ecstatic to have on the show today. It was someone who, helped. I had questions about podcasting to start off, and he was able to answer a few of them to help get the ball rolling with this. You've heard him before. He's a co-host of The Block Party, co-host of the POD Cast, one of my favorite podcasts, and he's also the co-host of Hockey Fight. He's got a comedy album out there, Long Stories for No Reason. John Cullen. John, how's it going?
Hey, man, it's going well. Thank you. Very nice intro. I don't remember helping you, so that's good. It makes me seem like I'm cooler than I am. This is great. I will say I don't know anything about Winnipeg wrestling, so if that is the sort of I listened to one of the episodes today just to kind of see, get a feel for the podcast, and you were talking about some federation in North Dakota, and I was like, oh boy, I'm in big trouble here. I've signed up for the wrong thing. This is going to be a problem.
Well, I mean, with this, I didn't want to limit it just to Winnipeg wrestling, and I mean, I didn't want to be just someone who talks about anything you can see on TV. I like to, just talk about the stuff I like, and it's I talk about the stuff I like and the stuff that makes me happy, and I try not to be too negative because who wants to listen to someone shit about wrestling for an hour or so?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that is what most wrestling podcasts are, isn't it? It's like, I feel like most of the vibe is like, if I was booking the WWE, it would be good. But because I'm not, it's bad. And it's like, which is fine to an extent, but also at the same time, you're watching 10 hours of programming a week. So something must be going right. Like no one has the capacity to hate watch something for that long,
Oh, for sure. And I mean, I'll tune into the big the big WWE events like WrestleMania, the pay-per-views, but the weekly programming, I just can't do it. So
it's impossible.
No, so I just don't bother, I'll read the reviews and I'll listen to a podcast about it, but I'm not going to watch it.
Oh, so. It's like a job. It's like a, can I swear on this?
Yes, by all means.
It's like a fucking job. That's genuinely what it feels like. And I you talk about the POD cast, even for that, I have to listen to 2 albums and 2 singles a month. So I usually listen to albums 2 or 3 times if they're albums I haven't heard before, and I'll listen to singles about the same. So that is 4 hours of work, and that's in a month. And that feels like a lot sometimes, especially if I don't like the album. I'm like, oh my God, I gotta listen to this Godsmack album again, or whatever. Whereas for whatever reason, but these guys, it's they'll have a twice weekly show, and it just seems impossible to keep up with. I think for most people, if you have a job or whatever, you can't, there's no way you could watch it all. Right. It's like being an English major. I was an English major in university. If you're taking 5 English courses in university, it is literally impossible to read all of the books you're meant to read. You just at some point you have to accept, you know what? I'm just going to be Sparks notesing these books. That's all I can do. And it's kind of like what you said about WWE. That's kind of all you can do. It's you watch it if it's on and if it's convenient, and otherwise you just have to rely on reading reviews or listening to podcasts, because I feel like it takes a pretty special person to consume all of that content every week.
And when it turns into a chore, that's when I tap out. I can't do it. So, I mean, we were talking a little bit beforehand, and you we're close to the same age. So you were into it during the Attitude Era, because that's when I was into it, big. So that's what we're really going to focus on today. Sure. Is just some of our favorite moments from there. Some of the stuff we remember. And I mean, it's easy to just gloss over and say the Attitude Era was great, when in reality there was a lot of really shitty segments.
Yeah.
So we'll focus more on the good stuff. We might, dabble on some crap, but I have a little bit of trivia for you today because today's April 27th.
Yes.
So April 27th, 1998, there was a huge moment in the Monday Night War, so to say. So do you know what took place on this day?
Oh, is this the tank day?
This was when DX invaded Nitro.
Whoa.
So
Holy shit. So we gotta have a good episode here.
I hope so.
We're standing on the shoulders of giants on April 27th.
We are waiting.
How old are we that was 23 years ago? Oh my God.
It's slightly depressing that I still enjoy wrestling this much.
Well, that's
and
true.
23 years later.
It's not that depressing, but I think like I still enjoy it too. I mean, maybe it sounds like I think, you and I being the same age is interesting because I think a lot of people had a similar pattern to at least me, and you can say whether yours is the same. But I was so I got into it in 98, but I wouldn't say like even the DX Nitro thing, I wasn't watching Raw live at that point. Like I didn't really get into it until later 98. And I remember watching WrestleMania 14 like on VHS. I remember I would get sick at school and then I would rent wrestling pay-per-views and watch them at home. And that was kind of how I got into it. But my sort of thing was I was so into it. Like I couldn't like anything more from like 1998 to about mid 2000. Was still into it in like 2001, 2002, but it wasn't like appointment viewing anymore. It was just sort of like I knew what was going on. I read my wrestling websites that I liked, but I wasn't watching every week necessarily. And then and then I just went dark. Like I didn't even watch WrestleMania. I didn't watch the Rumble, nothing for about, I'd say probably 8 to 10 years. And even went through a phase where I was like, I can't even believe I liked wrestling. Like what a pile of shit that is. And then you get to a certain age, like you get in your later 20s, you get more confident with yourself. You're like, you know what? Wrestling is like kind of fun. It's like not that bad. And then I got back into it, I would say over the last like decade. I certainly watch like WrestleMania and Royal Rumble every year. And then I'll watch, if the odd takeover here and there, the odd pay-per-view here and there. That's not WrestleMania or the Rumble. And that's sort of where I'm at right now. Like I'm pretty disengaged. I haven't watched a minute of AEW, which I'm sure is better than WWE, but I don't care and I don't watch it. And that's kind of where I'm at. Did you have sort of a similar trajectory or were you just into it the whole time?
I was a fan early 90s. That's when I first started getting into it. And then like 94, 95-ish, they got into like the new generation sort of thing. Yes. Where it was like Brett and, Sean, like when Mabel won the King of the Ring, like that's when I wasn't into it. And then I was watching, it was like late night TSN on a Monday and I saw like Monday Night Raw when they were still only an hour long. And I was like, oh, this is pretty good. I saw like Ahmed Johnson on there, I think it was.
Sure.
So then I started tuning in like every, week. So it was like 97-ish. It was right before SummerSlam 97, if I'm not mistaken. It was right around there. And then, I would watch, the 2-hour episodes Monday nights, get home Tuesday from school, rewatch it, watch like Nitro on Wednesdays. And like, I was hooked up until like 2004. Okay. And then that's when it just like, I lost all interest altogether. And I didn't think anything of it. I got back into it. I think it was the CM Punk when he did the pipe bomb.
Sure.
That's like, because it was something different. It was like he's talking about, like these different promotions and like, Paul Heyman, who wasn't really doing anything with them. And you're like, what's going on? So it piqued my interest and I got back into it after that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a similar story for a lot of us. And it's funny, like, you and I have talked about new metal and the POD cast and stuff. And I feel like new metal was a very similar trajectory for me where it was like, it's almost exactly the same as wrestling where it was like I was so into it and then it kind of exploded and no one cared about it after like 2002 and then I was like embarrassed, like I wouldn't listen to Korn. I was like, no, this stuff sucks, like whatever, who cares? And then again, same thing, I got more confident. I didn't care, I didn't think I had anyone to impress anymore and I was like, you know what, Got the Life still goes in pretty good.
Mhm.
And then it all kind of came full circle, over the last few years doing a podcast about new metal and everything. But yeah, it's funny how those two things I think kind of followed like exactly the same path for me in life.
And I mean, in the late 90s, early 2000s, they really like wrestling really embraced like the whole like new metal as a like
Totally.
using it for a soundtrack. I mean, because you were seeing, like Kid Rock performed on Raw, I think.
I was there.
Really?
Yeah, Kid Rock performed American Badass on Raw in Vancouver in 1999. I was there. It was also a remarkable night because Too Cool won the tag team titles from Edge and Christian after they received interference from Joe C., Kid Rock's dwarf hype man.
Yep.
So it was pretty, yeah. So, I mean, needless to say, that memory sticks out of
Well, because like they had Kid Rock. I mean, I remember Motley Crue, which I mean, they're not really new metal, but they for the time they kind of had a renaissance around then. And then
For sure,
I mean,
yeah.
Limp Bizkit, they performed on WrestleManias, and I mean, they were part of the WrestleMania 17, the My Way hype video for Austin and Rock, which is one of
video package ever.
Basically, it's right up there with the Creed My Sacrifice videos, like I'm not going to admit to liking Creed, but I will go nuts for those videos every time.
It's a safe space, Blair. You can say whatever you want. I mean, yeah, it's funny to me because we did so the soundtrack you're talking about, WWF Forcible Entry, which is where they basically had a ton of new metal artists re-record the theme songs. I was sort of, when we did the episode, I was kind of like, I only really remembered a couple of the WWE superstars using it. Like I didn't remember it being, and so that's what I said on the episode. I'm like, oh yeah, I can remember like Stone Cold definitely used the Disturbed one, and blah blah blah. And I remember Lita used that Boy Hits Car one or whatever the hell. But there was like a couple I remembered, but I was like, I think only a few people used these. And then someone corrected me, and they were like, no, at one point every single one of these was used as a theme. How long that lasted, depended on the superstar. But at some point, all like 18 superstars or whatever on this album used that song as a theme song. And I was like, holy shit. Like, I just kind of thought it was more of a gimmick than anything. But like you said, they really like went in on it, and they were like, yeah, this is if there's a musical genre we can have to represent wrestling, we want it to be this one.
Oh, for sure. And because I think even if it was only like one or two episodes, they used the themes, and it was the same with the WWF Aggression album that came out.
Yeah.
Where
was that a rap one? That was a rap one, right?
Yeah, because they had, Run DMC doing like the DX theme, Ice-T doing Godfather, and then it was like
Cypress Hill was like 6 of them.
My favorite.
These guys, Cypress Hill's not doing anything. They could do a few of these for sure.
My favorite one was like they had Sea Murder from No Limit Soldiers doing The Brood, and so it had like the Brood theme, and he's rapping over it. I was like, this really cool. This actually bangs.
I want to look. I'm looking this up right now. I want to see who's on this because I remember it, but I feel I remember it, but I at this time I would have been like so into new metal, which is ironic because new metal shares so many roots with hip hop, but I would have been so into new metal that I'd been like, oh, rap sucks. Rap sucks ass. No one listens to rap. But now obviously I like it. So, like ODB and Kool Keith doing the Mankind theme song. Like, what? That doesn't even make sense. This is so funny. I also love, and this happens when I know you're a listener of the PODcast. This happens when we get into compilations on the PODcast. Is there will always be like 2 or 3 artists on a compilation where you're like, I have never heard of these people in my life. I don't know how they ended up on here. And this one, we've got R.A. the Rugged Man, which I definitely don't know who that is. He's apparently was signed to Jive Records at 18 years old. No idea. And then we also have a guy named Rascass. And there's a guy here called Boo Capone, who is so unnotable that he doesn't even have a Wikipedia entry, which, I mean, if you don't have a Wikipedia entry and you were on an album as big as a WWF album, that's crazy.
I will admit to knowing who Rascass is, but it was only from one of those DJ compilations. But besides that, I know nothing else. So
you're like, I actually had a Rascast poster growing up. I was a pretty big fan, and I'm very offended that you
really. I run the fan club, and I'm taking this a little personal right now. So
we're called the Rascassholes. It's a pretty big deal, and there's 5 of us. We get together once a year. We have a conference.
So you talked about WrestleMania 14, and I think that was almost like it really kind of set the tone for a lot of the big moments, because that post Mania Raw, that, you know, it had the debut of X-Pac making his return after they had kicked Shawn Michaels out of DX, and it also had the New Age Outlaws versus Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie in the cage match to make up for the dumpster match the night before. And then they ended up joining DX. And the way that match ended, like, I remember I watched that match, and then I was so pumped because, like, I saw that happen, and I remember I had to go to work the next day, so I couldn't rewatch it. So I recorded it on VHS just so I'd have it on videotape, because I thought it was so cool that, like, oh, you know, Six from NWO, he's on WWF now, and he just, you know, went off on Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff, and this is so cool because you never saw anything like that. And then the Outlaws joining, and it really started to seem, it seemed to start like the whole sort of like faction thing, you know, it made it really cool in WWF.
Yeah, it's weird for me because the timing is very strange, because I know for sure I didn't watch WrestleMania 14 live, as I said, and so I don't know exactly like what pay-per-view I would have really like gotten on board with, where I would have started watching every week, because I had a similar story to you in that when I was a kid, I just watched TSN all the time. So I just didn't care. Like, I just got home from school, I put on TSN, whatever was on TSN, I just watched it. I didn't care about watching anything else. So that's how I got into curling, actually, because I just curling was always on TSN, and eventually I was just like, oh, this looks kind of fun, I'll try it. And then I ended up curling for 25 years of my life, but then or not quite that long, but close enough. And then wrestling was the same thing. It was just like on Tuesdays, like you said, it was right around when I got home from school, they would re-air Raw from the night before. I think it was from like 4 to 6 or 3 to 5 or whatever it happened to be. So I'd watch Raw from the night before, and I think eventually I just started getting more into it. But it's weird because I know I didn't watch WrestleMania 14, but I know for sure I watched SummerSlam 98. So it's like somewhere in that gap is where I got involved. I know DX was huge for me. Like, it's so funny when you look back, you were talking about how some of the wrestling was so bad. And like, it's really funny how now we care so much about the match quality and how good the matches are and whatever. And like, when I was a kid, the New Age Outlaws were my favorite wrestlers. I mean, I had a Road Dogg t-shirt. Like, I just thought they were the best. And you look back on their career, the New Age Outlaws couldn't have a 3-star match if it hit them in the face. But, you know, I mean, they might have had a couple with Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie, that those sort of those sort of hardcore-y matches. They might have had one in there that was like 3.5, 4 stars. But that's about it. Like, they didn't have very many good matches, but I loved them. And it didn't like DX to me, like X-Pac when he was in the whole European title run and winning the European title and stuff. That was huge to me. And then obviously Triple H and The Rock having their huge feud over the IC belt, and the New Age Outlaws. I just thought they were the coolest people around, and I loved everything they did. And that was like really kind of what brought me in to the WWF at the time.
So SummerSlam 98, it had, you know, Triple H and Rock for the IC title in a ladder match. And
unbelievable.
I looked back, and that was the 5th ladder match in WWF history. So there hadn't been one for a few years before that. What about that match stands out to you?
I just remember it was the first ladder match I ever saw. So I think I just thought it was so cool. Like, I just thought Triple H was so cool. At the time, I didn't care for The Rock. You know, I don't even think The Rock was necessarily a heel at the time. Like, I don't think he was in full heel mode. Like, he was starting that way, but he, you know, the corporation hadn't started. And like, you know, I don't think he was necessarily like full on, like, you know, Gucci shirt wearing heel Rock. He might have been. People will listen to this and they'll be like, you're wrong, John. He totally was, which is fine. I can't remember exactly, but I just seem to remember it was not necessarily a face versus face matchup, but it was kind of like people didn't hate The Rock so much yet. They wanted Triple H to win, but they didn't necessarily hate The Rock. And so I just love that. I just love that feud. Obviously, I just thought a lot. I just couldn't believe it. It seemed so dangerous to me. I'm sure if we watched it now, the spots, I know it's still a good match. I watched it maybe a couple of years ago. I know for sure it's still a good match. But as far as the like crazy spots, or what would have seemed like crazy spots at the time, you know, now in the age of crazy hardcore wrestling, and even what like the Hardys and Edge and Christian would do later the next year, you know, obviously far surpassed that. But it just seems so dangerous and so visceral in a way that wrestling hadn't seemed to me before. And I just was so caught up in the characters. I just think we lose sight of that when we're older. I think that we don't always think about the characters and how cool they were, and they just seemed so cool to me. And I thought that was awesome. And I loved Austin Undertaker on that card too. You know, because they had the whole tag team thing before that, right? They were like they were the tag team champions leading up to SummerSlam. So it was this whole thing. I was just so caught up in it, Blair. I just, everything about it was cool. And there was just, when you're 13, there's just something about a ladder match. It just felt like the stakes were so much higher than they had been before. Was it a big like feud that stuck out for you too, or where were you kind of at as far as your fandom went?
When I was younger, to me, that was my favorite match on the card. You know, like I was a big Austin fan, but I could never get behind the Undertaker. Like I was never an Undertaker guy. So to me, that it didn't really stick out as a main event to me. But having Triple H and The Rock, where it was almost like two guys who, to me, it seemed like they were on their way to break through to the next level. And it was only a matter of time before they got there. Like this was just, you know, the next step for both of them. You know, I was excited for Triple H to get that big Intercontinental reign and, you know, defend that for a while. It never happened. He got hurt, but it seemed like that's what, you know, was going to happen. It was going to be the next level before moving on to the main event scene. So I really liked the match. I watched it the other day in preparation for this after you had mentioned it. So I was like, oh, let's go back and watch it. And it's still a very good ladder match. You can't compare it to anything you see nowadays because they're night and day difference. But for the time, it was really good. And I think we sometimes lose sight of that. Is like when you're watching the matches like that, whether it's you know, a cage match or a ladder match in that era, they really stood out as something different and something that really meant something to wrestling.
Yeah, and I think too, the one thing that makes it easy to watch those older matches is just the heat. Like the crowds are so much louder and crazier back then than they are now, you know? And so I think that helps when you're watching it, because you're like, okay, the crowd is like losing their mind for this stuff. So it must have been a big deal, you know? And I think too, what you said was like a great point where, you know, that was the cool thing about old school wrestling. And I know a lot of people harp on this, and I'm not saying anything new, but pardon me, it was just such a cool thing where you could, as a fan, you could just identify like who was next, you know, like the IC belt was like, you know, you could see there was like a progression. It was like you'd come into the federation and you'd sort of be curtain jerking, or, you know, get, you know, in the middle of the card, you start to have better matches, and they give you some more promos, and maybe you get the European title, or maybe you have a tag team title reign, and then you work your way up to the IC belt. And then there were guys who, when they won the IC belt, you're like, this is it was almost like a mini coronation, because you were sort of like, okay, they've got the IC belt, they're going to probably hold it for a little bit, and then they're going to go up to the WWE title. And it was just this, it was almost like watching sports, you know, where you see like a kid get drafted, and then he's in the minors, and then he's in the next level of the minors, and then he's, you know, plays in preseason for the main team. And you're like, oh, he looks really good. Maybe he's ready this year. Maybe he's in it. You could follow their progression. Whereas like, it seems like WWE doesn't have that as much anymore. There isn't that sort of clear progression. It's like winning the US title or winning the IC title doesn't really mean anything. And often it doesn't get defended for like months at a time. And there isn't that sort of clear progression you could follow. And I think what you're saying is so right, that those sorts of moments where you had these two guys, and you could see at SummerSlam 98, you're like, these two guys are going to be the guys. Like, they're not the guys yet, but they're going to be, and they're facing off in a ladder match. This is a big moment. It's going to launch both of them. And it kind of did, right? And so I feel like that's something that's really missing from the current product, is that you don't have those sort of clear stepping stones anymore.
Yeah. They use, nowadays it's more, the titles are more just for storyline use as opposed to elevation use, because you can really make or break someone just by a title reign, but they don't seem to use it. Now it's more just a prop, and it's how they see fit to use it. So there's nothing we can really do about that, but.
Well, we have a wrestling podcast, Blair, so we are doing something about it. We're on a podcast. So.
Well, what's next is, if we want to do something about it, we'll start our own federation, and we'll really take charge, and then we'll show them who's boss.
Yeah, what's the Winnipeg landscape look like? I mean, can we make some noise over there, or what's the wrestling landscape?
Currently, because we're in
let's
the
imagine
pandemic,
we don't have COVID. What's the landscape?
Right now, there are currently 4 promotions that run shows.
Oh, too many. We got Winnipeg's no good. That's off the list. We got to be somewhere else.
we might have to do Vancouver. So
yeah, well, ECCW is gone because the guy who ran it is a piece of shit. So this might be the perfect time. We just got to get some money together. We'll buy the dojo, because ECCW famously has a really good training place that this guy didn't have anything to do with. So let's get Nicole Matthews on the phone. We'll call up the dojo. Blair, you and me will buy this thing, and we'll be good to go. Because 4 feds in Winnipeg, we can't compete with that.
We are a Lotto Max winning ticket away from starting our own wrestling federation. So
sounds good. The Grainmaker Wrestling Federation, not the wrestling podcast. The GWF.
The Federation.
So we're the Fed, man. That's it. I mean, it's so interesting, how much that has changed. And I think, again, it's hard not to think of when you were a kid and everything seems better when you were a kid and all that stuff. But it just, I can specifically remember feeling like winning the belts was such a big thing. And it was like a big deal to be a champion. And it just doesn't seem that way. And even just little things, like I can remember when D'Lo Brown was the European champion, and he would pretend to be from a bunch of different European countries. That was like his gimmick for a while. And it's like, that was the 3rd title down the line. WWE only had 1 weekly show at the time, and D'Lo Brown was being given 5 minutes of TV time a week to pretend that he was from France or whatever, and that was cool. Like I had a subscription to WWE magazine, and I can remember he was the cover guy of a magazine, and they had like a whole like D'Lo's European adventures, and it was like a whole thing about how he had traveled to Europe, and he definitely hadn't. It was like it was a joke. Like, it was very clearly that he was just like in front of a green screen with like the Eiffel Tower and the Leaning Tower of Pisa,
just holding a baguette, and
totally. But it was just so fun. Like, that was part of his character development, was he was like, I'm the European champion, I'm going to represent Europe. And because it was close enough to the time where British Bulldog had held it, and it was sort of supposed to be for Europeans. So that was also kind of part of the gimmick. And it seems like they just miss out on being able to use those, like you said, those belts as elevation. And it's just, that was so fun to me. And I loved it. And there were times when I would be more excited for the European title match on a pay-per-view than the WWE title match.
Because I think D'Lo and there was maybe a couple other guys, like Jeff Jarrett, I think was one of them. And they were like the only Euro Continental, like the dual champions, and
X-Pac, I think, was in there too, for sure.
Like, that to me, that was something special, and just the way they presented it, because you never really saw one guy holding 2 belts back then, that was almost unheard of. So for them to have 2 of the mid-card titles, you're like, oh, this guy might be sort of a big deal, even though it never really happened for D'Lo, but it was still entertaining.
Totally. So it's just, that part of it kind of sucks. And that's one thing that if I had my own, if you and I had the GWF, that we'd change it. We would like, are you an AEW guy, or are you watching a lot of that?
I do watch quite a bit of that.
Yeah. So is that something that they're doing more of? Because I do read like some of the pay-per-view reviews and stuff like that. And it doesn't seem to me from what I can tell anyway, that they have like really firmly elevated a secondary title. Am I correct in saying that?
They have started to. They have their TNT championship, and the current champion, Darby Allin, they've had him defending it weekly now on the program, and he's been having very good matches. I mean,
good. I like Darby Allin. He was here for Ballroom Brawl in ECCW, like, I don't know, 2 years ago or whatever. And he was fantastic.
The first time I saw him, I'm like, what the fuck is this guy doing? Because he does a coffin drop onto like a table, and I'm like, he's going to kill himself. And then you actually start seeing him wrestle more, and just the way he wrestles, like, because he can, ground wrestle a guy, and then with the flick of a switch, he's like a speedball in there, bouncing off the ropes and doing, flips and cutters and all this kind of stuff. And you're like, oh, this guy he's actually really good. And just the overall progression of him, I was amazed by it. But if you would ask me when AEW first started off, I'm like, I don't want to see this guy. But
well, I think too, they kind of, in the beginning, it felt like they sort of painted him as a bit of a garbage wrestler. So then, when you get sort of painted with that brush, it's hard to sort of shake that sometimes. I think as a viewer, you're like, oh, well, this guy, he's fun to watch, but he's always going through barrels. That was his big thing, right? It was barrels. He was always.
I think they had something like that.
But yeah, and it's, and he comes down with a skateboard and he hits the guys with the skateboard. Okay, whatever. He's just the skateboard guy. But I was always biased because actually a friend of ours, Josh, and myself, had seen him at Ballroom Brawl. And he just did this crazy, it's in the Commodore Ballroom here in Vancouver, which is about a 1,200 seat or 1,200 capacity music venue that they convert into a wrestling venue for these shows. And it's marked by like big pillars. And he just like monkey climbed up a pillar and like to the roof of the Commodore, which is probably like 20 feet, and just jumped off onto people. And it was like, because I've seen people jump off stuff at the Commodore, and ECCW is a pretty extreme federation. So, they do ladder matches and thumbtacks and blah, 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 all that stuff. Pardon me, which is cool, but I had never seen just that display of athleticism of just, I'm just going to climb up this pole that has no way of getting up it normally and just jump off. And, so I was always a bit biased, but it's cool that he's actually turning into like a guy.
Yeah, he's definitely becoming like a good like work rate kind of guy. Like, you're going to get a good match when you see him on TV now. So it's nice to see it. They're doing a good job working at elevating that secondary title. So it's a step in the right direction. You had mentioned Edge and Christian and the Hardys.
Yeah.
They had their match at, I think was it No Mercy?
No Mercy, yeah.
Okay.
Was that 98 or 99?
That was 99, and I had never seen that match up until this weekend.
What? No way, really? So, I'm sure you'd seen some of the other ones, just not the original.
Yeah, I'd seen the TLC matches, the other ladder matches they'd done, but I'd never seen the Terry Invitational ladder match.
Yes. The Terry Invitational tournament. That was man, how cool were they back then?
They love to do that kind of shit.
Oh my god, it's so funny.
So I put it on, and like, I'm watching this match, and because you almost grow numb to some of the spots because of everything we've seen since then, it's slowly building up. And one thing I noticed was I was watching the crowd, and the start of the match, everyone's sitting on their seats, and then they start doing some of these moves, like the ladder was positioned, and I think it was Matt and Christian were, standing near the turnbuckle, and Jeff like jumped off the ropes and hit the ladder up into both their faces. And then you start seeing the crowd, like half them start standing up. And then, there's another huge move, and everyone is standing by the end of the match, where at the beginning, like, they couldn't care less. And there was a few parts in there where like, I like audibly gasped. So I'm like walking on the treadmill. I'm like, oh, fuck.
Well, it's that one is one where I think anytime I watch it, I can transport myself back to the first time I watched it. And I remember watching it live, and it was just like, it was genuinely mind blowing. Like, it was genuinely, you can say obviously the wrestling's fake and this and that, whatever. But like, that was genuinely a time where I couldn't believe it, and it's, there's so much wrestling now, and you can see so much of it there. Feds stream on Twitch, and they stream on this and that, and there's podcasts and show like there is not only a federation, but there's also a subculture to that federation where you can kind of find anything now. It feels like everything's sort of been done.
Mhm.
Whereas like in 1999, like it just you can't recreate that feeling is what I'm saying. Like it just sitting there watching it and just genuinely being like, holy fuck, like what am I even watching? You know, like it just exploded my poor little mind. Like you just couldn't believe it. I think in that one too, there's that's where Edge is holding onto the belt and gets speared, or Jeff is holding onto the belt and gets speared, or is that later?
That was the TLC at WrestleMania.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So I'm trying to think of like there was a big like off the ladder spot. Is there not in the like from the kind of top of the ladder?
There was one where there was two ladders set up in the middle, and there was one guy from like Edge and Christian were on one side of the ladder, the Hardys were on the other side, and one of the ladders fell over and they were both crotched on the ropes, and then the other ladder fell over and they got hung up on the ropes. That was the one that I really remember from that one.
Yeah, I just remember there being a few spots like that where it was just, you just couldn't believe it. Just didn't make any sense. You know, it was like, not that I at that time I'd only been watching wrestling for like a year and a half, but it was almost just like, it was like they changed a calculation in your brain or something where you're just like, I've watched wrestling, but I have not seen this. You know, it was just a very strange. It was almost like a strange phenomenon to be watching it, and yeah, obviously they kind of topped themselves in the years to come. But that original one was so memorable, and like you said, it was almost like, I think the feud was good, but the whole thing of the tit was like people didn't care. You know, who cares if they're having a match to make Terry Runnels their valet or whatever. Like, who gives a shit, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that is what led to sort of the crowd maybe not being that into it. And just, yeah, like the crowd was all of us, you know, all of us at home were doing the same thing. And it was cool. And I honestly haven't watched it in quite a while. And I think it would be fun to go back and watch it because it really sticks out for me as just being a time where wrestling was truly transformative, where I just forgot what I was even watching. And I was just like, holy shit. It was so awesome.
I mean, you might get a kick out of this because, you know, you enjoy new metal. And I mean, Jeff Hardy and his attire, his very baggy pants. I was at
big Chico guy.
I was at an Impact Wrestling show in Grand Forks.
Yes.
I had second row seats, and I thought, I'm pumped. I'm like, it's going to be at the arena down there. I drove down there, sit in second row, and it was in like the ballroom of a hotel, and there was like 200 people tops. But Jeff Hardy was there, and during his match, it's quiet, and one of the guys behind me yelled out, "Hey Hardy, nice jinkos," and I lost it at that because like he's still rocking the same baggy pants. I'm the only one laughing, and I'm like, I couldn't deal with it.
I love when you go, and this is what I love about local wrestling too, is like there is something fun about knowing the wrestler can hear you. You know, when you go to a big stadium show and they might, you know, if you're close to ringside, the wrestlers can probably still hear whatever you're saying. But there is something about that, like being in a ballroom with like 500 people or less, everybody's quiet because they're wrestling in the ring, and you make a really good joke. It is just, I mean, we had one where it was a buddy's birthday, and we went to an ECCW show, and at the time the ECCW champion was actually the guy who, not the guy who was a bad guy, but who kind of owns ECCW. He wrestles under the name Scotty Mack, and he has like he's like your classic sort of douchey looking, really steroided, muscular type beachy guy. He wears big aviator sunglasses to the ring, wears all black trunks kind of thing, and he has like bleach blonde spiky hair. And so I just yelled at him. I was just like, "Frosted Tips." And I just said it like that. And I don't know why, but the 10 people I was with, it just became a joke, like a running joke among all of us for years and years, just to describe like anything bad or stupid. And then like two of the girls that were there had like their own sort of like baking company for a while where they made cupcakes and they named it Frosted Tips. And it was just one of those things for years. I'd see my friend Frosted Tips, and it just became this thing. And I don't know what it is, but I do think that is something special about the kind of local fed sort of thing. Like, talk to me about the Winnipeg ones, 'cause I don't know anything about them, and I know your podcast is about that, generally speaking. What's sort of your favorite one? What's the like good one in Winnipeg that you like to go to?
Well, there's one that I was going to monthly, Premier Championship Wrestling, and
PCW.
PCW.
Yep.
And PCW, it is actually, that was where Kenny Omega got his start.
Oh, okay.
So they used to run out of a local bar, and it was called the Palladium. And they started running in early 2000s, and they would have shows where, like Samoa Joe would be there that's when he first got started off. There is a match that is on videotape, but only a few people have seen it, of AJ Styles and Kenny Omega.
Oh man, in PCW?
In PCW.
Cool. Isn't the Palladium that's like a venue, like a music venue, right?
No, it was a nightclub in Winnipeg.
Oh, a nightclub. Because I feel like I've heard of like screamo bands and stuff playing there. Am I wrong in saying that?
I think there is a bar named the Palladium, but the Winnipeg one, it was a nightclub, and that was back when, they had dollar drink nights where everything was $1.
Sure. So this match, you've never seen it, but it's rumored to exist.
I've never seen it, but it has known to exist. So they used to do monthly shows at it's a place called the Travel Lodge now. It's a bar attached to a hotel, and I mean, they get the regular crowd out for their shows. I mean, you'll see anywhere from 40 to 100 people in there, When Kenny Omega makes his return, it's standing room only in there. It's impossible to get tickets.
Still?
He would still come back, and it would be like once a year, and he would wrestle local guys. And
That's
cool. And they'd actually, put on a very entertaining match. So it's always nice to see.
I like that. Yeah, when a guy comes back and sort of, gives the local guy the rub or whatever, and just like, that's a cool. That's sweet, especially when it's like, because I would say like ECCW, that happens. Most recently we would see that with El Phantasmo, because obviously he's in NJPW now, but he was like obviously a big ECCW star, and so he'll come back and wrestle on their Ballroom Brawl cards, but like there's 1,000 people there, so it's still like, yes, he's coming back and kind of doing them a favor, but it's still also like a pretty big show. Whereas like if it's a show that's normally getting like 40 people to it, like Kenny Omega has nothing to gain from doing this show. It's just like he wants to, give it up for where he came from. Like, that's pretty cool,
So there's Premier Championship Wrestling. There's Canadian Wrestling Elite, which is one of the bigger ones. And they actually will travel. They'll do tours. Like they'll go and hit up, like Winnipeg, Brandon, Saskatoon, Edmonton, Calgary,
Swan River, Morris.
Not as much the smaller ones, but they'll still hit up those.
All the tiny Manitoba towns I know from curling.
They'll head out west. They'll do a tour, usually with a few headliners. That's one of the bigger ones. And then there's a newer one called Winnipeg Pro Wrestling. And I
like that.
WPW.
Yeah.
They do like bar wrestling, and it's very inclusive, and it's they're doing something really special for wrestling, and I really like what they've done so far, and I'm really looking forward to seeing a show by them when COVID is a little bit better. So
Winnipeg Pro Wrestling. If I'm ever in Winnipeg again, you and I'll hit it up.
We will definitely. We will.
WPW. We'll make it happen.
They usually get a couple guys from that are, on the independents. It's almost like people who they're about to reach the next level. Gotcha. So it's like they have their eye out, and they know who's going to get there. And it's like, hey, come wrestle here. And like, there's a tag team in AEW called Top Flight. They're from Minneapolis. And I didn't know this until I started looking back at old results, and I was like, oh shit, they wrestled in WPW, a year and a half ago, so 2019, and now they're there. So it's nice to see.
For sure. I mean, yeah, that's something that ECCW was always good at, was that kind of thing. I mean, obviously for their bigger shows, for their ballroom brawl shows, they could bring in some like legit big names and guys that, you know, that were very well known on the independent circuit, or former WWE people that were on the independent circuit or whatever. Like we've seen TJP up here and, you know, guys like that. And, so it, you know, like I say, for their bigger shows, they can get some bigger names, but it's cool to see sort of the same thing where, like, you know, you look back and you see like, oh, cool, like those guys were here and those guys and that, you know, it's like when you you know, you go to the big music venue in your town or whatever, and or like the big smaller venue, and you're like, oh my god, like Radiohead played here once, or you know, like the Commodore, where the ECCW has those shows. Like I said, it's like a 1,200 cap ballroom, and like U2 played there when they were starting, you know, and stuff like that. And you're like, oh, this is cool. I feel like I'm in a, it's like you feel sort of, there's a sort of history, even if you weren't a part of it, it adds something to it, you know?
Yeah, it increases the aura of where you are. And it's like, it's something special and just adds to the whole experience.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what's cool. And I always love that about the sort of local wrestling. And I don't go as much as other people, but I go to a couple ECCW shows a year usually. And yeah, they put on a good show, and it's always a good time. And it's also good too, because it's sort of like seeing comedy in a way. It's like, you will also see people who will never make it. And that's kind of exciting too. You're like, oh, these guys, this is the top, this is the end of the line for this guy. He's been here for 10 years and he just does the same match every month, and we love him.
Like, I will always give it up for anyone who goes out there and, you know, puts their body on the line and is willing to tell a story, because I mean, they're doing it for the love of it, you know, because a lot of the guys aren't, you know, this is, you know, what they enjoy doing. They do it for, you know, whether it's to make a living or, you know, to entertain fans. And I mean, I have all the respect in the world for that. So the first show I went to, like, I went to a couple when I was younger, like back when, after ECW had kind of folded, and like the, you know, like Rhino and Jerry Lynn were doing like independents. Like I saw one at a community center here, but I didn't go for till about 2015 or 16. And the show I went to, there was like it was a PCW show, and like they started sort of having like a hardcore match, and one of the guys pulled out a bag of Lego instead of thumbtacks, and I'm watching a guy get slammed on Lego, and I'm like, holy shit, like you're not expecting this. And it's like, I mean, you step on Lego and that fucking hurts.
Oh yeah.
So
I know. It's like, the problem for me that I can't wrap my head around that stuff is I'm such a wuss. I'm like the biggest wuss on earth. Like, you know, like I think deep down, most of these people kind of like it a bit. They like the pain a little bit or something, like, you know, not necessarily that it's a sexual thing, although probably for some of them it is, but just like, you know, they just sort of, they don't mind it. They're just like, this is my idea of fun. I get kind of beat up a little bit, and that's like fun to me. That's not fun to me at all. So I'm sort of, so like, sometimes I'll be at a local show, and like I say, I think the ballroom brawl shows are like a step above. There's a, like I say, 1,200 paying people there. It's a big deal. So those shows, I can kind of wrap my head around some of the more hardcore stuff. But it's when you go to their sort of off brand shows that are not even in Vancouver, they're kind of like outside the city, and there's like 100 people there. And, you know, and they're hitting each other with chairs, or they do a thumbtack spot. And it's like, I didn't pay enough to see this. Like, I shouldn't be able to see this for $10. You know, like, I want to know that you're making some money, or there's some sort of exposure that's happening for you to do this. Cause I didn't ask for this. So you should stop doing it. It makes me uncomfortable.
Like, you hope that they really have to love it when they're doing stuff like that. I mean,
it's like they love it too much. Like, I do stuff that causes me no pain at all. And I'm like, I don't love it nearly as much. I love apparently risking their body for whatever, my entertainment.
So one of the big things, like back when we were, you know, watching Attitude stuff, was the crowd reactions. Like, because you would hear some of those pops that it would blow the entire roof off the arena. And I mean, so much of it was around Stone Cold, because I mean, the crowd just loved him. There's, you know, Austin 316 signs and shirts everywhere. And I mean, I rewatched Mankind winning the title, and like
it's the best. It's like one of the best videos on YouTube, period.
The crowd is so into the match as it is, because you had, the corporation out there, you had DX out there, and then after the ref bump, and like there's the brawl outside, and you hear Austin's theme go off as soon as the glass shatters. It is fucking electric in there.
It is like, it's crazy. There's a couple things that are crazy to me about that clip. And like I said, even if you're not a wrestling fan, it is just genuinely one of the most fun clips you can watch on YouTube. First of all, the pop is so loud, the camera is shaking, which is insane. I mean, they're using like high-end camera equipment, that's static camera equipment. I mean, if you ever go see a WWE live event, they literally rope off like a full section of seats so that they can put the cameras down. They're like stationary giant cameras, and the pop is so loud the cameras are shaking. And then the other thing is, like, it's not even just the noise, but if you look in the crowd, like, there are grown men just losing their actual mind. Like, it is like, it doesn't compare to anything else. There's not even sporting events, your favorite team wins the Stanley Cup or the Super Bowl or whatever, you don't see this level of fandom. Like, there are people who truly, it's like they don't even know what to do with themselves. Like, if you look, I love to watch it every time and just try and focus on like a group of like 3 or 4 people in the crowd, because with no exceptions, it doesn't matter what part of the crowd you're focusing on, you can see like literally people just forgetting that they're alive. They're just their bodies are all over the place. They're screaming, and these are like, in some cases, probably 30, 40, 50-year-old people just losing their shit. Guy in a fake thing. I mean, it's unbelievable. I love watching it. It's so good.
Everyone gets so invested in it. And I mean, like, truth be told, that I'm a Leafs fan, and if they ever win the cup, I'm going to be cheering just as loud as some of those middle-aged men when Steve Austin's music hits. So,
men, and it's all over. Yeah, I'll be dead probably if they.
That'll be me if the Leafs ever win. But there was a few other ones that I really noticed was when Austin pulled out the beer truck.
Yes.
If you remember that one.
Oh, classic.
And during the terribly run invasion angle, when Austin sort of disappeared and everyone's wondering whose side is he on, they need his help. And you have all these, jabrones from WCW like Sean Stasiak and Chuck Palumbo, they're beating down WWF, and all of a sudden, his truck pulls up, the music hits, and he storms out there and just starts cleaning house on everyone, and the crowd is just going ape shit.
I just don't know how he as a man kept it together. Like, that's the thing. Like, first of all, like, obviously I know like he's kind of had some like documented issues with alcoholism and stuff like that, but like you'd have to be chasing that like the rest of your life, right? Like, how do you, that's got to be the hardest part, I think. Like, I do comedy, and obviously, you have some nights where it's just magic with the crowd, and this is on such a smaller scale than Stone Cold, but you just have the odd night where it just feels like you and the crowd are so in sync, and they love every word that's coming out of your mouth, and they're hanging on every word. And it's such a good and fun and rewarding feeling. And you come off stage and you're just like, this is what I do it for. This is amazing. And Stone Cold basically had that for like 3 years straight, every single night, and then, like you say, and then on top of that, had these like crescendo defining moments where everyone just lost their mind. And it's like, how do you live after that? Like, I feel like I would just be constantly chasing that feeling, because it must have been incredible. Like, you hear your music playing and people are just losing their mind, and like I say, how do you even keep it together to perform? I'd be Ronda Rousey. I'd be like looking around like, this is so cool,
just grinning ear to ear, so happy. And you're
I'm
like
a villain, but I'm smiling a lot and I love everybody, but I'm the bad guy.
Well, I watched like the A&E's been doing biographies on some of the wrestlers. Like, they just did one on Austin. This week's was Roddy Piper. And I mean, the one with Austin, he basically said like when he had his last match with Rock at WrestleMania 19, like he knew that was going to be it for him. And he had to just step away completely, like almost disassociate himself with wrestling. And he really was for quite a few years. You know, he had the odd appearance, but then you didn't hear tickety boo from him until he started doing podcasting and stuff. So he almost needed that break just to kind of reset and like just be a regular person again.
Yeah, and that's what I mean is like that's got to be so hard. And I know obviously like pro athletes retire and they don't know what to do with their life and blah blah blah. But this is almost like a different level to me where it is just like he was so beloved in a way that no one else was. I mean, you know, you can talk about The Rock and whatever, and The Rock's my favorite wrestler of all time, but it wasn't it was never the same. The Rock it was never as big as it was for Austin. With him, even when he became Hollywood and returned those few times and whatever, it just no one could reach. It was like the perfect crescendo of like when wrestling was the most popular it ever has been and ever will be. It'll never be that popular again. And you are the top guy, and you're like the top guy that's ever been in wrestling. Like it's just he got to be the one person that got to live that, and it just that's so hard for me to imagine how you turn around from that.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I mean, Austin and Rock, those were the two guys like for the Attitude Era that really were like, they always talk like how it's always usually one guy in an era that stands out above, you know, but Austin and Rock, it was two during the Attitude Eras. But if you really look at it, I mean, Austin, he did have almost a more electric career with the way the crowd reacted. And I mean, you know, The Rock maintained it longer after Austin, but for the 3 years, Austin, he was, you know, wrestling almost, you know, The Rock was there, but Austin was another level.
And he was doing Letterman and he was doing all the, you know, he was the guy doing all the stuff. Wasn't The Rock. The Rock wasn't on the cover of Rolling Stone. The Rock wasn't being interviewed by Guitar World because Austin jokingly played an acoustic guitar on Raw once. You know, I don't think that happened, but you know what I mean? It was like that level of like, you know, Austin could have been on the cover of any magazine he wanted to be at that time. And then, yeah, like I can remember specifically like taping David Letterman because Stone Cold was on it, and taping Jay Leno because Stone Cold was on it, and taping Regis and Kathy Lee because Steve Austin was on it. You know, like he was the guy in a way that no one else has ever been the guy. And people could say Hogan, but there was just something a little bit different, at least as far as like, I think electric is a good word. As far as like biggest pops and like biggest guy, I think Stone Cold had a bigger moment than Hogan did. Hogan obviously did it for much longer, but I think as far as like a singular moment in time, I think Austin had the biggest moment.
I've gone back and I've watched like, because I mean Hogan was huge in the 80s and 90s, and I was never a Hulk Hogan guy, but you pay attention to his career, and I went back and I watched some of the stuff he did in WCW, and there was matches that were just absolutely atrocious. I mean, he had one where it was him and Macho Man against like 9 guys in a triple decker cage match, and they went over all 9, and you're like, how is this entertaining for anyone? You know, it basically, he just used it as a vehicle to get himself even more over, but it didn't help anyone at all.
Yeah, for sure. And that was the thing with Austin, right? He would put guys over, and he was capable of having a good match. I mean, he was pretty hurt, you know, for most of the time. So he couldn't have the types of matches he had earlier in his career, but he made a style that worked for him, and he knew how to work his match, and he knew how to bring it out of other guys too. And I think, yeah, when you look back, you know, Hogan was never a good wrestler. And so, you know, that was one thing that Austin always stuck out with him, was that he was a good wrestler and he was able to have good matches with lots of people. Whereas like Hogan really needed the right guy to bring out a good match in him. Whereas Austin could bring out a good match in a lot of other people.
And even one thing I always liked about that time frame was there was about 6 guys that you could interchange in the main event picture with, you know, like to always have a fresh matchup, you know, like, cause you had, you know, Austin, Triple H, Rock, Undertaker, you could throw Kane or Mankind in there, Kurt Angle. So there was always a fresh combination. I mean, you might only get a Kane main event once every 2 years, but it was still something different. I think it was
even
like
with the factions, right? Because even with DX, like I can remember X-Pac, getting a main event sometimes or whatever.
Mhm.
Just like you knew he was never going to beat The Rock for the title, but it made sense because he was in DX and The Rock was in the Nation or the Corporation or whoever it happened to be. Like, yeah, exactly. All of those guys were believable as like a one-off main eventer just because of the circumstance and because we knew enough about them, right? Like there's no character development on the undercard anymore in a way that there used to be. Everyone on the undercard got development back in those days. You knew who you knew what most guys' motivation was, so when you elevated like a Billy Gunn or even like a Gangrel or something like that, you knew their character and you knew what they were about. So them being in the main event, you're like, well, they're not going to win, but like I can believe that they belong here because I know enough about them. They're not just some guy that I know nothing about and I couldn't possibly care less, right?
They would build up the story enough that it fit into the larger picture. If it's The Rock and Triple H, that's going to be the blow off. Then it makes sense that X-Pac is wanting to go at The Rock, to weaken him and take him down a notch, to try to get the best of him. So The Rock's going to win, but it's still believable leading up to it, and that it does miss nowadays where you don't get that as much.
Yeah, totally. So I say that's also GWF. We're going to bring that back to event at any time. Everyone knows their characters, and anyone can main event.
We are going to have such a well-developed undercard, and like it's going to be fantastic.
The top of the card's going to be horrible. No one's going to care about the main event, but man, are those undercard guys going to be hot.
The main events are just going to be absolute garbage, but I mean,
just dog shit. The TV title match is going to it'll be like WCW when the cruiserweight title match was always the best match on any card.
I can still go back and watch those matches and still be completely entertained.
Any five of like Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, Kidman, Juventud, and throw in whatever other guy you want to. It was like any combination of those guys. You're like, oh, this match is going to whip ass.
Yeah, and then they would bring off one like a random luchador that you've never heard of, like they brought in a guy named Blitzkrieg, and you're like, who the hell's Blitzkrieg? And he has just a great match with Psychosis, and you're like, all right,
classic too. Got him in my five.
The one thing I will never forget was, I think it was at WrestleMania 15, because they started giving like Road Dogg and Billy Gunn, they separated them as a tag team and were like, hey, we're going to push you guys as singles now. And they
they were pushing Billy Gunn. Like Billy Gunn was going to be the champion. He's king of the ring. King Mr. Ass. King Ass.
But they gave Billy Gunn the hardcore title and Road Dogg was the Intercontinental title. And I'm like, maybe let's switch these, like it makes more sense for Billy Gunn to be Intercontinental and Road Dogg to be the hardcore. But what do I know? I'm a 16-year-old kid, so.
Yeah, it's okay. We'll take care of all that. We'll settle it all. The right guys will have the right titles, and everyone will be happy all the time. Was
there anything else that like really stood out to you back then? Stuff that you really enjoyed?
I don't. I think we covered most of it. I think the only other thing I would say in our GWF pitch that I loved and I think we need is I just loved the branding of the events. It made them way more cool, like remember when Backlash had like the swinging hooks in the entrance and, Royal Rumble was at Madison Square Garden. So they had the taxi coming through the entrance and then Jeff Hardy did the swanton off the taxi and just like every pay-per-view felt special, not only because I was a kid and I was watching it, but every event felt unique because they all had a really unique setup and they all looked different. And so I can specifically remember being a kid and being almost as excited just to see what the arena looked like. Like that was like a cool thing to be like, holy shit, there's swinging hooks in the entrance. This is unbelievable. Like, or when there was a buried alive match on the card and they'd have the grave like out in front of the Titantron or whatever, just to start the show. And you're like, this is going to be sick. Everything looked different. And I think it really contributed to how special the events felt. And I think the sort of homogenized nature of the product in general is reflected in that sort of thing as well, where it's everything feels the same all the time. And I miss that aspect of it where you'd pop just because the entrance looks so cool.
Mm-hmm. Now you could interchange any pay-per-view as like just the regular TV because it's the same setup,
Totally.
it's just the Titantron and the ramp, whereas before, you'd have, like ladders hanging from the ceiling or whatever, just to differentiate it. But now it's so by the books that it's very ho-hum. So
totally. And even in WrestleMania, like I can remember when they first started regularly doing WrestleManias in the stadium and you saw the super long ramp and the multiple video and he was like, oh man, this looks so cool. And then it's just been that way for the last like 5 WrestleManias. And it's like, well, who cares? Like, I want to see something new, it's just something different to look at. And it just gives it that sort of big fight feel, it's wrestling, I think, was so good back then at sort of copying some of the right things from boxing and MMA and lending the big fight feel to the pay-per-views and to the big matches that is completely lacking now. And that's why for me, just even as a casual viewer, I could envision a world where I would watch every WWE pay-per-view and I would just subscribe to the network all year and I would just watch the takeover and pay-per-view every month if I felt like it meant something and if it felt like they were new and fresh feeling like they used to feel when I was a kid. And now I'm just like, no, I watch Royal Rumble, I watch WrestleMania. That's it. Those are the only ones that stick out to me. I just love the Royal Rumble match, always have. And then WrestleMania is WrestleMania. You got to watch it. But then other than that, there just is nothing that excites me anymore about it. And so, yeah, I think that they could very easily get me back as a network subscriber and a monthly viewer just by making simple changes like that, where I feel like, damn, I got to watch every pay-per-view.
I mean, because when I was younger, we would usually get together at my parents' place. Sometimes there'd be 20 of us piling in there and we'd order pizza. And my parents are wondering who half the hell these people are. But it's all people we went to school with. It's just like, yeah, bring $5, you can watch wrestling. But there was like 2 of my, good friends growing up, Doug and Davey. We would, we had our own wrestling website back then.
Dougie and Davey.
We were the D boys, I was, there was D-Man, Danger Zone Dave, and I was Cheeks Pac, we tore it up. So, but
Cheeks Pac.
We would watch, we would get together.
Insane, man. Cheeks Pac.
My last name being Pachico, so everyone would call me Cheeks.
I understand where it came from. Hilarious to me. Because I think even when I was younger, I was like, what is an X-Pac? What does that even mean? I don't think anyone knows. To this day, I don't think it's ever quite been explained. Like, I guess it's like 6-pack, but you're saying like X-Pac. Like, I don't know. I don't know where it comes from. So it's already one of the dumbest names, and then Cheeks-Pac. Oh baby, I love that.
We had thought
you were an undercarder.
I basically was. We had our wrestling website. I had my weekly column I wrote on there, and I thought it was I was gonna make it big writing about wrestling, but didn't work out that way. But we would get together, and the Royal Rumble was always the one that like. That was the one that always stood out because like the Royal Rumble, I think it was 99 when it was McMahon and Austin had their big thing. Yeah. And I always remember the crowd in the front row because the music would hit and they were just so into it. Like the Oddities music hit and they're bouncing back and forth, waving their arms. And then like the Brood's music hit and they're, just having the time of their lives. And that always stood out to me for some just strange reason.
Yeah, we don't have, that's the one, like, that's the only thing I think would be on my sort of wrestling bucket list is I want to go to a Royal Rumble live. I think it would be, and it was supposed to be in Seattle before COVID happened. So I would have gone, but unfortunately it didn't happen. So that's my main thing. I'll have to make that happen at some point in my life because it's just the best.
Was it 2019 when SummerSlam was in Toronto? Because I had ended up, we bought tickets to go, me and a buddy. He had to, last minute, he had to cancel. So I went out there just knowing that, like, some of the guys, like that Josh was heading out there and a few other people was like, hey, I've never met you guys, but hey, let's meet up. And me and E-Prime, Eric, we we had messaged being like, he was coming up from Detroit, and it's like, oh, you want to split an Airbnb together? And I've never met the guys, and it's like, yeah, let's do it,
Yeah.
So like,
whatever. We're in a Twitter DM together, so who cares?
To this day, I'm still like, thanks for not killing me. I appreciate that, But like going out there and just meeting up with everyone, like that was like just it was the time of my life, you're just hanging out with friends, talking wrestling, having beers, and it was just the experience, and I look forward to doing that again.
Me too. I mean, I've never done it, but I look forward to doing it for the first time again.
You'll get that first time in you, and it'll just be so momentous that you'll have the time of your life.
Stop. Well, my fiance might have something to say about that. She'll let me do it once. We'll see how it goes after that.
I think my girlfriend is quite content just being like, yeah, you want to go watch wrestling, go with your friends. Just enjoy
That's
that.
nice. Yeah. It's more just the like, I think it's the, oh, you're going to spend money and go on a trip, and I'm not going on the trip. Okay. That's more the just before everything shut down with the pandemic. Actually, I went to a bachelor party in Phoenix, and definitely like it was a bachelor party. So, I kind of, you get let off the hook a little bit because, it's a bachelor party. So whatever, but it was definitely like, we went in March. It was like plus 25. It was beautiful. I was like in the pool and just having a good time, and she's stuck up here and it's freezing cold, and like, fuck you. I want to be in Phoenix. Kind of. So, you gotta play your cards right sometimes.
Like on my list of bucket list, like there's a promotion in California called PWG, and they're one that I've always wanted to go see, and it's just in like a little legion that they run shows. So it's I basically said like, I can go there, and you can go to the beach and check out breweries, and we'll both have the time of our lives, and we'll both be happy. So
that's good. Yeah, that's
crossed,
the thing. I think that's it. Like I gotta wait till Royal Rumble's somewhere nice, and then I can, have a couple days with the boys doing Royal Rumble and takeover activities, and then have a couple days with the wife, and then we're good to go.
Then you're set. So, John, thank you very much for doing this. Where can people find you?
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show. Always a good time. Didn't know we were gonna get into business together when I started this podcast, but I'm excited about it. If you want to find me, I'm just online. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Cullen the Comic. As we mentioned earlier, I have a couple podcasts. Blocked Party. It's a show I do with Stefan Heck, where we bring on a guest every week to talk about a time they got blocked on social media. You can follow that at Blocked Party Pod. And then the aforementioned Podcast. If you're a fan of wrestling, you're probably a fan of new metal. It's myself and Brian Quinby from Street Fight Radio. We review old new metal albums, or classic new metal albums, we could say. And it's super fun. We do it once a month. We've got 20 episodes, so you got a long back catalog if you're just starting out. And you can follow that at the POD_cast, and we spell cast with a K, like the band Korn, on Twitter.
I see. Like I had no idea about the PODcast until you were on Columbia House Party reviewing, I think it was Significant Other or Hot Dog. Yeah. And then I was like, this is awesome. And then you're like, yeah, I've got a new metal podcast too. I was like, what?
This was right up my alley. I know you messaged me and you're like, this is exactly like, I feel like this is content that was made just for me. And I was like, I have a whole podcast, man. And you're like, what? And it's weird because I think when you do different like online things, and you have a podcast, so like, I think you just assume that like anyone who follows you would know that you're doing that thing. Because I feel like I almost feel like guilty sometimes, where I'm like, oh, I think I probably share my stuff too much. Like I share Block Party and I share the PODcast, and people are probably sick of me. Like I don't ever think like, oh, maybe someone's following me that doesn't even know about it. Like, and that's very possible if you don't check Twitter that much or whatever, like, or you're just not on it when I'm tweeting about it or whatever. Like, it's very easy for that to slip through the cracks. But I think it never even occurred to me, because I think when you got into it, we were already over a year in, and you were just like, oh wait, like what? This is here. So it was really funny to me. It was just cool because obviously I've known you for a while, and it was just funny to me that you and I are like in the same Discord, and we follow each other and stuff, and you just had no idea that was happening.
So you told me about that, and I had like listening material for like 3 weeks straight on my drive to work. I was like, this is incredible. And I mean, almost, I can't remember the last episode you guys did. I think it was Godsmack. And you and Brian had me howling nonstop. Like, it was great.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, it is such a fun one to do. It's like, it's that thing of, it's like kind of a niche thing, but if you love it, you really love it. And like all of our fans are so cool because it feels like it was a moment in time that not everybody was a part of, kind of like the Attitude Era of wrestling. It's like, if you know, it's kind of one of those things. And I think Brian being 6 years older than me and like actually being like in it is so interesting, even just to me, where he's like, yeah, I saw Korn in a club, and I'm like, you what? That kind of, like, it's just, I was at Woodstock 99. You what? Like that kind of thing where it just blows you away. And he's such a fun guy. And so, yeah, it's one of those, like, I think both me and him, it's just a pleasure to do. It's cool that we can make some money off of it and have a Patreon and whatever, but we would do it for free. It's just so fun. And it's just, yeah, it's a blast to do. And it makes me so happy that people like yourself really like it, because we love doing it.
Like, I'm waiting for it to come out that Brian was one of the guys holding up like the wood panels that Fred Durst was crowd surfing on during his performance. And that'll just top it off for me.
He did a ton of drugs, right? So I feel like sometimes he just also kind of forgets. Like he'll just casually bring something up on an episode, and I'm like, what? Like, it just blows my mind. And he's like, I feel like I told you that. And I'm like, you did not tell me that. Never know when
John,
that's going to happen.
Thank you very much for this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks everybody for listening.
Okay.